As an aside, I'll say, there's an interesting note. I was recently writing a chapter for a book that will be published and doing research on the Zion Episcopal Church in Talbotton, which you may know of. It was recently restored. It's also a Carpenter Gothic church. It dates to about 1848, 1850. The bishop of the Diocese of Georgia at the time, who I'll talk about more, Stephen Elliott, there was a rapid expansion of the Episcopal Church in Georgia at the time, and there was an interesting thing that he had said in one of his speeches at the Diocesan Convention, which was, we need to build cheap churches that cost no more than $1,500 or $1,600 in order to get a building built. And then we can improve those buildings later on. And that was ultimately what Carpenter Gothic did. Zion Episcopal, it cost more than that, but that was part of that sort of program that Stephen Elliott had laid out, which was to build these cheap churches, get here, plant that flag, because there's too many Baptists and Methodists. So, we got to fight. But because it was simple to build and relatively inexpensive to build, the Carpenter Gothic persisted in Georgia at least until the 1880s. There's an example up in Cedartown, Georgia, that dates to the middle 1880s. It's quite a lovely, I believe it's a little Episcopal church up there. This church happens to be the third oldest in the state in this style. St. Stephen's in Milledgeville and Zion Episcopal in Talbotton are both older. This is the third of 5. So you're somewhere in the middle. But it's interesting because nationally it's a relatively late example of the style. 1868, 1867 actually, 1868 is a relatively late example. But the interesting place where this congregation and this church building holds, the interesting place it holds in Greensboro is that even though the Baptists and the Methodists in Greensboro had established congregations far earlier than the Episcopalians did, the Church of the Redeemer, this building is the oldest house of worship in Greene County, and it's the oldest in continuous use as well, 154 years. Probably not telling you anything you don't know. So the Church of the Redeemer, this building, was designed and built not by an untrained itinerant carpenter, but by the architect and Civil War veteran, Captain John Gibbs Barnwell. John Gibbs Barnwell. It's a G, not an O, so unfortunately.
We found that out recently.
It's in cast iron out there, but so be it. Just use a Sharpie on it, it'll be fine. So Barnwell was born in 1839. He was the third John Gibbs Barnwell in his branch of the family. Confusingly, there was a cousin who was also named John Gibbs Barnwell. It was a common name in that family, but that was a prominent Episcopal family from Beaufort, South Carolina. His father, John Gibbs Barnwell II, was an artist and amateur architect who would serve for a decade as a librarian at the University of Georgia in the 1860s, from basically 1861 to the early 1870s. If you look at newspapers of the period, you will find Major Barnwell's reports of the weather. He was apparently an amateur meteorologist as well. He reported the weather, which was published in the papers of the region. So there it is. In the early 1850s, Major Barnwell, so there's Captain Barnwell is your architect. Major Barnwell is his father, but the name is the same. Major Barnwell had designed the main building for Beaufort College and also an expansion of the Beaufort Arsenal. He was an artillerist by military training, and in the Civil War, the Major had served in the Beaufort Artillery. But let's see. So the other confusing aspect is the other John Gibbs Barnwell from the other branch of the family was the librarian at the University of South Carolina in about the same period. So I don't know what was up with the Barnwells and their library habits. Nevertheless, but what's more important than the Barnwell story is that a critical family connection comes from Major Barnwell's wife, who's a woman named Emma Elliott. The Elliott and Barnwell families were intertwined over several generations with periodic intermarriages that bound the two families together very tightly. Emma Elliott was one of 12 children, and among her siblings are two brothers of particular note. The first was the Right Reverend Stephen Elliott, and the other was the Reverend James H. Elliott, both of whom I will talk about in a moment. From 1855 to 59, Captain Barnwell, our architect here, was educated at Harvard College, although it's not clear if he ever received a degree. At the time, no American college or university had an architecture program, but Harvard had the Lawrence Scientific School, which did teach courses in science and engineering, so he may have had some training at the Lawrence Scientific School. But it's also likely that he learned from his father, who was an amateur architect and had already done buildings in Beaufort. Unlike the Major Barnwell, Captain Barnwell became a professional architect. He hung out a shingle as an architect, and that was his sole profession. This was his first commission, we think. It's the first building of his design that we know. He was 28 years old at the time. And in the time, architects, I can speak from personal experience, we don't get into construction. We draw things, we tell other people how to do things, but we don't do the things themselves. In the 19th century, that was a very different thing. And architects were sort of master builders in the old sense, in that they often supervised construction. So they were superintendents and contractors of a sort, and also the designers. And that is the role that John Gibbs Barnwell, Captain John Gibbs Barnwell, played in the construction of this church. He supervised its construction in addition to designing it as well. And there he is as a much older man. After the Greensboro Commission, John Gibbs Barnwell established an architectural practice in Rome, Georgia, where he lived for the remainder of his life. There he came to know Martha Berry, for whom he designed the first buildings at Berry College between 1900 and 1911. The Barnwell Chapel, here on the screen, from 1911 was named in his honor. Barnwell died in 1918 in Rome, and he's buried in Myrtle Hill Cemetery in that city. I have not found a lot of information about, I haven't found an obituary, I haven't found anything that really says when. We know when, but not why. I wonder, in light of the pandemic, that whether the Spanish flu is what ultimately got John Gibbs Barnwell. It would be really interesting to find that out, because it would be a great irony to sort of celebrate his legacy in the midst of a similar pandemic. His grave location, it is believed that he's buried at Myrtle Hill Cemetery in Rome, but the site of that burial is unrecorded. I went there several weeks ago and spent 2 hours walking around, hoping that some lightning bolt would strike and point me to it. It was a fruitless 2 hours. I have no idea where he is buried there. So if any of you feel like wasting some time walking around a very hilly cemetery, go to it. It's there. The hammer beam trusses. So I think you can see there's an obvious similarity. Barnwell died in 1918. This was in a 1911 building. This is an 1868 building, 1867, 68. There are similarities between the forms of this church and what he did at the Barnwell Chapel up in Rome. So in addition to Barnwell himself, the Elliott family has a significant direct relationship to the Church of the Redeemer. For more than 25 years, the Right Reverend Stephen Elliott was a major figure in the Episcopal Church in Georgia. In 1840, he was elected the first bishop of the Diocese of Georgia. So when the congregation in Clarksville, when Grace Church in Clarksville was established in 1840, it gave the Episcopal Church in Georgia enough parishes to elect its own bishop for the first time. Because prior to that, the bishop had been elected, the Bishop of South Carolina administered the Diocese of Georgia. So the Reverend Elliott, who was a South Carolinian, as we know, was elected the first bishop of the Diocese of Georgia, which is a role he held until his death in 1866. The Reverend Elliott also played a primary role in both the schism and the reunification of the Episcopal Church during the Civil War, serving as the bishop of the Episcopal Church of the Confederate States of America from 1861 to 65. His brother, the Reverend James Elliott, had originally served at the old and venerable St. Michael's Parish in Charleston, South Carolina. But with conflict engulfing the city in 1865, Stephen Elliott convinced his brother to take up the reins of two small parishes in the Georgia Piedmont. As rector to the Church of the Advent in Madison and vicar of the Church of the Redeemer in Greensboro, the latter of which had no church building at the time. In 1867, while still serving in Greensboro, the Reverend James Elliott commissioned his nephew, John Gibbs Barnwell, to design and build the new church building. In 1868, after the completion of the church, the Reverend Elliott left Georgia and moved to Boston, where he became the editor of the Christian Witness. And while there, assisted at Trinity Church and at St. Paul's in Brookline, Massachusetts. Reverend Elliott's successor in Greensboro and Madison was the newspaper editor and minister of the gospel, the Reverend Joshua Knowles, who served in that role until his death in 1887. As you know, Reverend Knowles and his wife were interred in the Remembrance Garden located on the north side of the church, only feet from where we are today. So, Marie, would you like to? Marie Ramsey is going to present the chronology of the church history.
Not sure how well the...
Yeah, you can't see that, but it says September 1863.
No, that the congregation of the Episcopal Church of the Redeemer was formed in 1863, and that was several years before the church was built. A handwritten ledger begins with the date the parish was organized, which was September 21st, 1863. So that means the church was founded during the Civil War, and it would have been soon after the summer of 1863, when the fall of the Confederate stronghold at Vicksburg, Mississippi, and
You're set.
and the devastating losses that the Confederate Army suffered at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, had begun to sound the death knell of the Confederacy. And this was the year before the march of Union General William T. Sherman through Georgia that would occur in autumn of the following year, 1864. So on that date, September 21st, 1863, Bishop Elliott met with the group for the first parish communion, which was held in the home of a member of the parish named Philip Clayton. A vestry was established then with Mr. Clayton, John Carmichael, and Philip, and I'm not quite sure how you pronounce this last name.
Philip Poulain.
L-L-A-I-N. I guess it's something like Poulain. And they were the vestry members. And at that time, the Reverend W.W. Lord was identified as the missionary. Although the vestry members of the church were male, as you would expect for the time, the impetus for founding the congregation really came from several women who had moved here from Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah to move farther from the war zone. And here they met two families in Greensboro who were already Episcopalian. And these founding mothers of the church included Miss Elizabeth Gilsby, who was an English governess to the large Poulain family. And the women banded together in their desire to form a church for the town's children.
That says the church property was purchased in February of 1867.
Yeah. The Redeemer congregation started with 14 communicants who met in local homes. As attendance grew, they rented the town hall for worship services. They started a building fund under the guidance of Bishop Elliott. Miss Gilby made the first donation in the $100, and that enabled the purchase on February 9, 1867, of the plot of land on which this church was built. The land was previously owned by Holcomb G. Harper, who was the father of Mrs. Philip Clayton. And at the time, the Reverend James Elliott was serving as vicar to the congregation. And he was, I believe we figured he was a nephew of Bishop Elliott.
Brother.
Church history states that the building was completed in 4 months, although it's generally stated that the church was built in 1868, which is the year in which the building was consecrated. References in the local newspaper, the Greensboro Herald, indicate the existence of a church building by the end of 1867. An article from May 1867 in the Augusta Weekly Chronicle recorded progress on the church building that year. The Episcopalians have erected, but have not yet completed, for want of funds, a beautiful little Gothic chapel here. It cannot conceive how limited means could be more judiciously and tastefully expended. The architect is Captain Barnwell, late of Maxie Gregg's regiment. The officiating minister is a brother of the late lamented Bishop Elliott, who alternates between Madison of this place. And Bishop Elliott had passed away in December 1866. And we know from some papers that we recently found among the Clayton family papers at the University of Georgia that Miss Gilby came through again with more money and helped to pay for grading of the grounds around the church, the building of a chimney, and the installation of a stove. And those receipts and the expenditures for what she had donated for were recorded in late 1867, October through December. And on December 21st, 1867, a brief notice in the Greensboro Herald stated, "We are requested to state that divine services may be expected to be at the Episcopal Church on Christmas morning, commencing at 10 o'clock.
Consecration of the church.
Then the June 11th, 1868 edition of the Herald reported that services will be held in the Episcopal Church on Sunday next. Right Reverend Beckwith is expected to be in attendance. This was the congregation service of June 14th, 1868, reported in church and diocesan records. Church records also indicate the contribution of Reverend Elliott, and I quote from the records, "under whose pastorate a handsome church was erected and consecrated by the Right Reverend J.W. Beckwith, the second bishop of the Diocese of Georgia." And there was a shocking development in the church's history in July 1871 when lightning struck the church, causing some damage of note. The North Georgia Citizen, which was another local newspaper, reported in July 20th, 1871, the Episcopal Church at Greensboro was struck by lightning a few days since, shattering the timber and weatherboarding in several places and tearing up a portion of the floor. Fortunately, the church didn't burn down and was here to be added to in the winter of 1875-76, and that's the final development in the evolution of the 19th century portions of the building. That was when the bell tower was added to the front. It was clear to us from our on-site observances that the steeple was a later addition to the church, but finding some record of when it was added proved elusive. Success came only a few weeks ago from two sources, the first of which was a report on parish activities from the 1876 Diocesan Convention. At the time, the parishes in Madison and Greensboro were served by the same rector, and then by this time it was the Reverend Joshua Knowles. It was noted that the prospects for growth in the Greensboro Church, with 13 parishioners, were decidedly brighter than at Madison. The report records the activities in the parish since the previous year's diocesan convention. Quote, "Through the liberality of the senior warden and backed by generous contributions of citizens of Greensboro and elsewhere, a handsome steeple has been added to our small church and a bell provided, which has secured a large attendance upon our services. A liberal-hearted lady of the congregation has also contributed 2 handsome chandeliers." It was in November of 1875 when the Greensboro Herald reported, "We have been shown a very handsome design for a steeple to the Episcopal Church, and that the ladies of the church had raised $135 for the purchase of a bell." It seems likely that construction of the steeple began at the end of 1875, but it would have been completed early in 1876, though we have not been able to establish an exact date.
They probably had enough
The growth of Episcopal churches in Georgia in the latter part of the 19th century and early 20th led to the creation of the Diocese of Atlanta in 1907, and Greensboro then became part of the new diocese. From its inception, the church has remained small in membership. By the 1970s, its rolls had dwindled to only 3 or 4 families. During the lean years, local lay leaders sometimes led the services when a priest was not available. As we've already seen, the church was sometimes yoked with a church in a neighboring county, and served with the same priest serving both. The fortunes took a change for the better with the creation of Lake Oconee in 1980, accompanied by rapid growth in Gulf and retirement lake communities. That led to increased population in the area and membership in the church. In 2003, the vestry called a full-time priest for the first time in 20 years. Despite the vicissitudes of membership, and I might add in recent years with the coronavirus pandemic and electronics that provided the ability to continue worshiping via Zoom, the Church of the Redeemer has never ceased holding regular services since its founding in 1863. And that makes it probably the oldest continuously operating congregation in Greene County.
Any questions?
Amazing.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff, and you can tell a lot of the primary source research we found was newspapers, which are fortunately digitized. It's a project that a lot of libraries in the state are doing, and so it's amazing what you can find. Joshua Knowles was both a newspaper editor and a minister as well. And so he had worked at the paper in Milledgeville, and then he periodically wrote for the paper here in Greensboro as well. But the records, sometimes you find what you're looking for, sometimes you don't. But there are a couple, with the Georgia Historical Society being closed still, they're both because of the pandemic, but also because they're expanding their archives, their space. And so it's still not open to the public, and there are some of the records of the diocesan convention that we know we need, which we cannot get a hold of, and so we're just waiting it out. John, you had a question?
One thing is we need to keep changing mics. And secondly, give a little background on the young lady that just presented.
So Marie is a graduate student. She's, I think, a brilliant writer, trained as a journalist earlier in her life, and then went to work as a lawyer for the CDC, and has recently retired from CDC. You are retired now, correct? Are you retired yet? Have you retired from CDC yet?
Not quite.
She's on the extended plan. This has been 2 years of retiring from CDC. So it's something that's interesting about the program that I teach in is that it's really geared towards non-traditional students and people who want to do something different. They've retired, or they're reaching a place where they just want a change of pace. And so we get a lot of really interesting folks. And Marie is just, I think, a prime example of that. And Joyce as well. Joyce works at Georgia State and has for quite a while, and wanted to finally do what she wanted to do with her life. And so, and somehow she ended up in historic preservation. Probably the opposite of what I should have done. Nevertheless, so it's a really, I think it's a treat for me to teach these folks because they're interesting and they bring different perspectives. And the journalism gene in Marie was really useful in digging and sort of knowing what to keep and knowing what to move past. So I think it really helped. So the report, I'll just say, the report that we did is 75 pages, which we have not actually given to the church yet. I don't know why. The pandemic prevented my email from working. No, So we'll send that to John and to Reverend Bill and get it in your hands, because that includes both the historical information and also the assessment, conditions assessment and so on, which you can take or leave it. But it's a nice document. And done entirely by student labor. So I hope you all enjoy it.
I do have a question. You mentioned that when the renovation was going on, you were crawling around looking at the foundation and up in the steeple. And do you have anything to say about what you found material-wise?
It's very typical of, this church is fascinating because it's one of the few that I think you all know this. The frame is the frame and the outside of the building is the inside of the building. And it is, you talk about economy, there it is. But the thing that's sort of brilliant about it is that because, if I take this board off right here, that's a hole in the wall.
Yeah.
So that board has not been changed since 1867, since the church was finished. So the level of intactness in this building is far higher than what you would have in a conventionally framed building, because you can't just go making holes everywhere. Underneath, it's framed as you would expect it to be. I was really pleased to see when this whole section of the floor was out exactly how the joists pocket into the sill beam that runs down the length of the building. The tower up above is fascinating because it's essentially 4 giant timber posts with kind of truss work that goes back and forth to kind of hold it together. But the way that it globs onto, that's a technical term by the way, the way it globs onto the roof of the church, half of it's outside of the body of the church and then half of it's on top. And if everyone turns around and looks back up there, you can see those 2 diagonal braces that come down are supporting the whole front edge of that tower and bracing it back to the timbers that are on the outside wall of the building. Now, the large square panel that has board and batten in it now used to be where the rose stained glass window that's now in the tower used to be. And if any of you have been up there, it's plain to see because there's a big hole that was cut out that was then covered up later on. The hole was where the window used to be before it was moved into the new tower, into that new wall. So there's so that we knew, like Marie said, we knew that it was not original, but getting that date was the last piece of the puzzle. The date when the tower was put on, because we were hoping that a newspaper article would mention it. That's typically the kind of thing you would see, but it was interesting because simultaneously she came up with one. The newspaper article Marie found, we were emailing back and forth a couple weeks ago. I found the diocesan record, the convention record, and so at one time we said, oh yeah, what's that? That answers that question. So it was a really nice find. There's still some little bits and pieces from a couple of diocesan conventions where like I said, the records are in the Georgia Historical Society, and we can't get them yet.
Were the timbers milled or hand hewn?
This is where my memory goes flat. I believe that everything is sawn in this building. Although I may be lying to you completely. Because they were still working even as late as the late 1860s. The carpenters working in this area were still using a combination of circular sawn timbers for smaller members and hewn timbers for bigger ones. So I'm telling you the sill beam is sawn, but I may be absolutely wrong. It may be hewn, and the posts in the corners of the tower from the 1870s, I believe, are sawn, but they also might be hewn. But all this lumber, actually all these may also be hewn as well. I'm going to have to give you a non-answer. But it could go either way, but it's pretty, the framing system, the braced frame that you see here is pretty typical for the period. It's an old-fashioned system, not to go off on a tangent, but I will anyway. In bigger cities, framing systems in houses and churches moved into the modern era in the 1850s. Georgia persisted in a very anachronistic way of framing buildings for a long time, even into the postbellum period. So here you see a church, it's a postbellum church, but it's framed as though it could have been built 35 years earlier, and basically the same thing. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Oh,
In climbing up into the steeple, did you find anything unique or were able to trace any history on the bell?
I'm a chicken and I did not get up there and see the bell.
Not you personally, maybe, but one of your
So,
students.
I don't know, did anybody, I don't, I'll get back to you on that. I don't know that anybody went all the way up to see the bell.
They're often cast somewhere else, long, far
And it would
away.
have the founder's mark on it as well, which would be really interesting to know.
Okay.
You've identified an avenue of investigation that we need to follow up on.
I'll pass.
Yeah. Any volunteers?
We do have some information on the bell.
Oh, good, good.
Yeah, and I'll, because when it was repaired, they found the sister bell, I believe, in
Somewhere in St. Louis or something.
St. Louis, Missouri or something, so they did track it down. Bob Newell researched that, and I'll get that to you.
That'd be great to include.
And the other thing is, this sill beam here was hewn.
It was.
That one had been replaced because it rotted out.
Okay.
But the original one here, and I think it's 14 by 14.
Yeah.
It's a huge piece of wood.
It's just interesting to know that there were still people around that knew how to do that. You know, where you take a log and you strike 4 lines on the corners and you take an axe and you square it off. It's an amazing skill.
You'll actually see the shavings. There's still shavings down.
That's great.
Yeah.
I have a son that does that in Japan every day.
That's about the only, well, one of the few places where they still do that. They have crazy joinery in Japan.
Right.
So he's at the, that's the place for that. It's terrific.
2,000-year-old trade.
Yeah, amazing. Everybody happy?
Well, this is a little bit off the topic, but one of the things we discovered when Curtis Wessel was doing the renovation work was that stained glass window back behind the altar, which was a straight line, if I got this right, John, a straight line before the renovation. What he found was originally, it wasn't that. It was more of a bowed window, so that the stained glass light would come upon the altar. And so that distorted that.
Yeah, the lower part is bowed. We put it back to its original location, but the reason we were getting damage back there was when they repaired it a while back, they actually moved it back in. But when we took it off and started looking at it, we actually put it back in the way it was supposed to be. So
There was an interesting bit in the report that you might, if you read it, is that, Joyce, did you talk to the woman? Do you want to talk a little bit about the glass? You talked to a stained glass restorer in Athens?
Yeah, if I could recall, yeah, it's been a year and a half
Yeah.
since I spoke with her and read the report. She believes, yeah, she did the restoration. I don't know if it's finished.
So
Yeah.
Okay, so she had information, and she said typically, the window probably came from Charleston and was delivered by train.
Yeah, it would
Can't
have been.
remember.
The
And
Georgia Railroad, as you know, runs through from Charleston to Augusta and on to Atlanta via Greensboro, Mass. So,
yes, I can't, it's just been a year and a half since I spoke to her.
on the spot.
And that it came in a sheet. I don't know, it was something interesting, I can't remember. It came in a sheet, probably one long piece.
And then cut and fabricated once here.
Yes, put together once it arrived here. Yeah.
Sure.
It was interesting speaking with her because she also renovated in Washington, Georgia, the hotel.
Fitzpatrick Hotel?
Yes.
Yeah.
I stayed there right after I did the class, just to investigate. So she knew practices and patterns in the area, and renovating or restoring stained glass windows for 40 years or something, a long period. And she had that information. I can't quite recall.
Okay. It's in the report.
Yeah.
Was the small Trinity window done at the same time as the large stained glass window?
The up at the top, yeah, they're contemporary, and you can see the orphaned one up above where the rose window used to be.
Oh, yeah.
So they're all very consistent with the same. It's interesting that the side windows were clear. I mean, as far as I know, this has always been the case. but the two ends of the church had the stained glass.
I thought the same thing. Interesting.
It's probably very expensive.
Yeah.
Got enough money, that lady died, got enough money, paid for the stake money, didn't have
Yeah.
anybody to give it.
It's interesting that, you know, those connections, the Charleston to Greensboro connection, this sort of coastal plain, both the migration of the folks who founded the congregation and then the migration of the clergy from the coast to here. It's a very interesting story that I don't think has been told before. So putting those pieces together. So thank you all.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it.
You have a copy.